Hi, I'm Jeremy Law, and I'm back to talk about some rapid games from another online Metropolitan tournament. This time skipping a week to number 34. I didn't play in 33, so I didn't really know much about those games. But same format as always, 10+5 rapid format within the Metropolitan Club. Quite a few games this week decided in the opening, so we'll touch on some of that. Okay, so my first round was against Volatility21, who's a regular of these. He loves his sharp openings, so I'm not really surprised to see a 2 knights with knight g5. And we've seen most of this before, but he knows what to do against my b5 nonsense, so I'm playing the main line with knight a5. Main line continues, bishop b5 check, trade on c6, and bishop retreats back to e2. So black has gambited his pawn, and white now, with a slightly errant knight on g5, has to catch up in development and consolidate. So this is more or less the main line, and I'm starting to round have theory about here. And this knight looks a little bit vulnerable to me. f2 is also a little bit vulnerable. So my move, queen d5, is trying to prevent white from castling. The only way white has to defend this is f4. So after bishop c5, another aggressive move pointing at f2, white just defends it and is completely okay. My next move, castling, just carrying on with development, overlooks a little tactic which wins a piece for white. Pause if you want to find it, though the game record probably gives it away. c6, knocking the queen back. And this controls the b4 square, so the pawn just picks up an extra piece here. So not the greatest start to the tournament for me, and quite sharp-eyed by Ash here. I've still got some play, so I kind of try to make the best of it from here. Bishop back, Ash takes his piece, and I knock out this knight on e5 and get my pawn. And now we sort of have a look and try and evaluate the position a little bit, because I'm a piece down. But white's king is still stuck in the middle. These pieces are behind, and my other pieces are going to get into the game quite quickly. So I'm behind, but I've got a lot of undeserved compensation for it, and it's really not an easy position to play for white. The computer's plan here is to play g3, covering this pawn, and then sort of manually shuffle the king over to relative safety. But this is not a particularly natural plan, especially because the computer line involves giving up a whole exchange on f1. So Ash turns his attention to the queen side and tries to get his pieces out more directly with d4. Unfortunately, this opens up the e-file and has some fairly nasty consequences. And already computer quite likes black now again. So queen takes d3, and now rook e8, getting on the same line as the king. White can finally develop some pieces, but now when the king's running away, this bishop turns out to be slightly loose. This queen is short on squares as well. So bishop f5, defended by the queen, actually leaves this queen very, very short on squares. This is something you want to keep hold of so the king can go to safety, and you want to try and control this diagonal so that no queen check will force the king back into the center. And yeah, options are thin. Ash plays queen c4, allowing rook e4, attacking both. And even though queen c6 does attack this pawn, this rook in the corner, black is in time to take on f4, because if the rook goes back, as in the game, we can trade off our rook with check and consolidate like this. Whereas if the king comes forward, bishop e4 immediately does the same thing, protecting the rook on a8, attacking the queen, and allowing black to save the rook and just sort of continue initiative against the king. So this is actually winning the piece back for black, and leaving white in a bit of a jam, because still behind in development, still with a weak pawn, still with the queen kind of floating about with not very much to do. And I felt good here. A computer actually thinks it's completely winning already, because white has no way to get everything into the fight before losing material. So game continued, queen c4, I get this check in, and the queen into b2, even rather than taking the knight immediately, is actually more precise, because white gives up the full rook, can't get the piece back because this is pinned. So white resigns there, and that was game one. And I think the main takeaway from that is, even though knight g5 in the two knights does look on the face of it quite aggressive, it's always black that has the initiative and is attack, trying to demonstrate compensation. And I can't really take credit for this piece sack, as it was a blunder rather than deliberate, but it's just a negative that it's hard to play white in these sometimes. So the next game was another round one. I thought it was quite interesting for different reasons. It's Haj with the black pieces playing Hippo against Nev chess, or Mark with the white pieces. And Mark has done exactly what you're supposed to do. He's developed all his minor pieces, he's put his pawns in the middle and he's castled, while black has hung back, just developing his pieces on the second rank. And the question which black is asking white is, now what? Now what do you do with your nice position, which computer rates at plus 0.6? And it's really not an easy question to answer. Because, well, you don't want to rush these central pawn breaks, because black can often just close the centre and kind of nullify white's lead in development and stop any lines from opening. Sometimes if you've got a pawn on c4 or a pawn on f4, that gives you a few more extra options for breaking open the centre, but that's not the case here, and it's hard to make that happen with the pieces as they are. So white sort of has to be patient and just continue to improve the major pieces, maybe grab some space on the wings, and just sort of make black prove that he can get back into the game and actually get a show of the centre. Anyway, white plays sort of slow improving moves for a little bit. Black continues to get his pieces into good squares, fianchettoing bishops. White is now pressuring this pawn, so black can't castle, and entertainingly plays king f8. And white now decides to break in the centre, but as I sort of alluded to, black can just close it, and the king is surprisingly safe on f8. So I save the bishop. This piece now looks a little bit blocked, so does this piece. Black's got this main pawn break, which he plays immediately quite bravely, given the king is still there. But it's still not entirely clear where white should be playing. So white takes on f5. The interesting thing is quite often in these sorts of King's Indian positions where white has taken on f5, taking back with a pawn is a good idea. Point of this is you're controlling the e4 square. In the game, when we take the knight, white gets to post up a knight on e4, which prevents this pawn from moving, is really stable here, and that prevents this bishop from ever doing anything. And okay, it looks nice to kind of trade off the dark square bishop, but the bishop that's left on the board is this one on g7, and the knight that's left on the board is this one on e4, and it's hard to make the argument for black that this is really better. So instead, black can play this. And in this position, notice you're actually threatening to trap the bishop straight away, but even if that wasn't a tactical threat, the sort of strategic idea of pushing e4 through makes this bishop an absolute monster, gives your knights squares in the centre, and drives away this, and maybe you can really unleash on the king side and get some mating attack. So often worth considering. But as played in the game, knight takes, grabbing this bishop. And we arrive at another position where white's position looks nice, but it's not immediately clear what to do, and white sort of drifts a little bit. Because black's plan is now fairly obvious. You've got the open f file, so black will sort of gradually gang up on the king side and go hell for leather over there. I think white, in the meantime, probably wants to start doing something on the queen side. Playing for one of these breaks, perhaps, supported by b3 maybe. And another thing to look at is this bishop is really out of the game at the moment, and it'd be good to get it back into the game on this diagonal at some point. Nonetheless, not much of that happens in the game, and let's skip ahead because black actually executes quite a nice attack on the king side. So as discussed, king is now safe. We're doubling on the f file with the rooks, and Mark's realising the danger to his king. Knight is now threatened, has to back out. This is the only real square, which well, I suppose it could have gone to g1 actually. But this knight is now the only thing guarding this square, and that's quite awkward for white as well. So Henry now reroutes his white square bishop to attack this pawn, which is hard to defend without keeping the king pinned on the king side. So Mark pushes to defend it, and black starts to infiltrate on these light squares. Notice that's another defender here. We're threatening just to come in with the bishop. So Mark moves the rook away, but now queen comes in as well, and black really is in a total bind. This knight is hard to protect, but it sort of needs to stay there to cover the square. King runs, but now the rooks are crashing through, and that's more or less decisive. So nicely finished attack by Haj there. I just thought it was an interesting game, mostly because this discussion of what do you do as white versus the Hippo, and this point about g takes f5 in the middle game. And then our final round 3 game that I want to talk about is Nick versus David. David has the black pieces, and we've got a fairly symmetrical exchange Slav structure, but the middle game had quite a few tactical sequences which worth looking at. So in this position, for example, white's just played knight b5, unleashing attack on this knight. Best move is probably to move it away, but black just defends. And now quick 2-mover, knight takes f6, if queen takes, white picks up this extra piece here on g4. So nice spot by white. Black now hops into the centre, threatening a fork here, which is covered, and plays f6, which is a sneaky move with a bit of a threat. Unfortunately, there's a kind of tactical flaw with it, but white just comes back with a knight, and after trading h4, now actually traps this knight on the g4 square, because everything's covered or occupied. I think the way to get out of this fight might have been this, although, well, c7 is the best move, but f3 would create enough squares with tempo on this knight to hold the piece. But having got here, Nick finds a quite interesting idea of just disrupting black's pawns. Because after takes, white's in exchange down for just a pawn, but if we look at the position for a little bit, we can start to understand why the computer still rates this as favourable for white. These two bishops are very powerful, and in particular this light squared bishop can be made an absolute monster because black's kind of weakened his pawns in the centre a little bit. So this is a target, and we can start to undermine the c4. In fact, computer wants to start playing c4 almost straight away so we can really get going on this diagonal. There's a lot of important pieces here. We can't take this pawn immediately because that would allow rook h7 skewering the two bishops. So bishop comes back, and that's why black plays h4. But yeah, now white is getting going on this diagonal. So both players had a lot of chances in that, but it was a hell of a fight, and shows you sort of how tactical sequences will decide most games. This is a round 2 game. David and I both were on our round 1s. So I start with knight f3, and we have a symmetrical English with d4 early. I think the best move here should be to take this pawn straight away, and we'll get some kind of Maroczy bind type position. Black can develop his pieces fairly harmoniously, or even fianchetto gets some kind of accelerated dragon position. And white will have a big space advantage, but black gets its standard hedgehog play. The problem with black's move in the game is it allows white to push. And this is basically now transposing in a Benoni, but one where black has spent a tempo on b6, which is not a massively useful move on this line, and white's got the extra move in knight f3. Now, the Benoni's already a kind of risky enough opening as it is, so you don't really want to end up in a Benoni with a tempo down. And that sort of plays itself out over this game. So black now making normal moves, starting to chip away at these central pawns and developing, kind of consolidating, and this is exactly a modern Benoni line, but with these extra moves in. Now black gets a little bit ambitious and sees that he can attack this pawn, and it's not massively straightforward for me to defend it. So it was after bishop d3, bishop f5 attacks it 3 times, and well, I could defend it with queen e2, but unfortunately castles is even more annoying for black. Point being, after takes, and takes, black has not won a pawn because the pin against the king is impossible, makes the e4 pawn immune. So if that's a blunder, black now has lost a tempo moving this bishop again, and the queen's kind of in the way of development, and this is a bit of a disaster. We're now in sort of a 3 tempo down Benoni. So white's job from here should just be open up the e-file and attack this king before black can untie himself. And there's sort of a nice sequence over the next few moves to sort of illustrate how that happens. And sort of a finishing touch, d6. This is a major problem for black, because if they take, or even if they go back, knight c6 is discovered attack on the king, winning the queen. So black cut losses and decided to just castle. Final point, we could just trade, but this diagonal is extremely vulnerable for black now, and bishop g5 is sort of just threatening to get onto there. And now smother mate in a few more moves. So black resigned before allowing that, but always nice to have the smothered mate. So for that game, yeah, I think main takeaway, you don't want to allow a tempo down Benoni if you can help it, and just the tactics not working out here means that this queen e7 idea is just too risky, and black wants to be getting castled. So final round, I had Hadj as an opponent, who we met in an earlier round, and he has white, and he's playing Scotch. So knight f6 is one of the main lines against the Scotch. Taking on b6 and going for this e5 push is the really challenging way to play this as white. So queen e7 pins this, and sort of forces white into doing the same awkwardness here. So now both bishops are blocked, and it's a really unusual position. Knight has to move because it's attacked. c4 keeps kicking the knight around, and I move back to b6. And what white's set up over the next few moves, he's aiming to play g3, bishop g2, b3, bishop b2, and castle, and then perhaps start to push on the king side. And it's quite a harmonious setup. The sort of key part of it is this bishop is now blocked in on this diagonal, so it wants to end up fin-chatteaued, and that's why a5 is played, which wouldn't really make much sense unless you're anticipating b3 happening fairly soon. I think the main line is to do g3 first, and then after queen e6, black's planning on moving the bishop out and castling. But Henry in this game played b3 straight away, which I didn't know as a move, but my thinking was, didn't I just play a5 to sort of target against this move a little bit? Can't I play a4 and start causing trouble? So that's what I do. We're now threatening to take on b3 and sort of shatter white's pawns because of the pin on the a rook. So white plays bishop b2 to protect that rook. And now the forcing line takes trade on a1, and the queen can come in. And now unfortunately Henry needs to play queen d1 to protect this bishop, because after bishop c3 that's an opening blunder and this piece down. I was sort of interested by this line. I went to look at this up after the game in one of my favourite opening books, Play the Opening Games as Black by John Ems, which has been a really useful reference this year because I've been switching over to playing a lot of E5. Just to sort of see what Ems made of that line and if what's going wrong. And I was kind of interested to see that B3 is actually a playable line. He gives it exclamation mark, question mark, or interesting move, which means it's slightly skeptical but sort of playable. This move seems to court trouble, as it invites black to initiate a rapid attack with 10a4. However, if white plays accurately, he can withstand the early onslaught, and the positions that arise demand positive play from both sides. And he gives that whole line which happened in the game. So, as far as here, saying white has to be careful here, for example, 14 bishop c3 loses immediately, and then gives the theoretical line of queen d1 to cover, then bishop here, and despite this pin, white plays king e2 on move 16 and claims he can untangle just fine, and that this is a playable position, which I thought was kind of an interesting idea. You don't often see king e2 on move 16 being the theoretical line when queens are still on the board. So one for the Bongcloud fans. Anyway, that took me to a win. Nev came second this week, and Hash came in third. That concludes my roundup of the online tournament number 34. Thanks to participants and for Beta, as always, for arranging it, and thanks for watching.